Hello. Good evening, everybody. I'm Larry Kay. Many of you know me and some don't. I'm co-chair of Herrick Feinstein's Art Law Group, together with Howard Spiegler, who is in the audience, and our partner in the group, Frank Lord, is one of your panelists tonight. We're delighted to see you all here for another in our series of lectures to put on together with the art newspaper. We've been doing it for several years. We have great turnouts. We've had interesting topics and lively panels, and we are just couldn't be happier with that partnership and hope that it benefits all of you. We're here to educate. Tonight, I'm going to be one of the ones who gets educated because I don't know too much about blockchain technology in the art world or elsewhere. So we just want to say that our art law group at Herrick is one of the oldest, and we hope one of the most prestigious art law groups in the world. We've been around since actually 1970 at least, and it dates me a little bit, and Howard too, but we've enjoyed our run. We've seen the art world change a lot. When we started out, we didn't know we were an art law group. We didn't know there was such a thing as art law. But we've discovered that, and it's changed and morphed over the years to the point where we can have events like this to show how everything's changing more quickly, possibly, than we can even absorb it. So without further ado, I turn the evening over to Sarah Hansen, who will be your moderator, and wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us tonight for what I hope will be an illuminating and lively discussion. And thanks again, especially to my panelists who have been so forthcoming with their thoughts and suggestions as we've been emailing back and forth, preparing for this panel over the past couple of weeks. So I'm sure that you've all heard of blockchain by now, and I'm also sure that we're all coming into this with varying levels of understanding about what it is and how it might benefit the art industry. So I'm going to start off by saying a few words just about blockchain basics and just make sure that we're all on the same page for the grounding so that we can move on to a more fruitful talk later on. So today we are here to talk about a topic that is relatively new in its relevance to the art world, but has actually been in existence for almost a full decade. You're probably aware that blockchain is the technology that makes possible cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. Bitcoin, which was founded by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008. So for the first few years, the focus with this technology was on how blockchain could support these decentralized, universal digital currencies and financial exchanges. But now there's a lot of talk about how it could underpin a whole range of activities, including secure data transmission with its automated, frictionless checks and balances system. And you've probably also heard a lot of pitches about how this could be used to do incredible things in the future. And there's quite a lot of blue sky thinking out there about how blockchain could transform the industry. And I think we just need to meet the evangelism with a little bit of critical thinking. So I hope that's what we'll do tonight. So I'm going to just put up a couple of slides to hopefully explain a little bit about the technology. Please be gentle because I made these myself. So basically, the blockchain is a public digital ledger that chronologically records a data exchange between two users. It's fast, it's decentralized, it's virtually immutable. So here's an explanation of how data enters the blockchain. A transaction between user A and user B enters the distributed network as part of a block or group of contemporaneous records from multiple users. Computers known as miners verify the transaction and compete to add the latest block to the chain by solving a cryptographic puzzle. When one miner solves it, the others check the work, and when a majority have approved, the block enters the chain, and a new block enters the chain roughly every 10 minutes. So you can see user A, user B, and how all of that works there. So how could blockchain be used in the art market? We have smart contracts, digital identifications, licensing of images, title registries and provenance, supply chain support, paying with cryptocurrencies, tokenization, and securitization. And there's no way I can touch on all of these tonight. So we will be focusing on the 4 that are highlighted in orange here. So With that, I think we can proceed to the discussion, and I think we'll start off with smart contracts. So, first up, Frank, I would like to put this to you first. What is a smart contract, and how could that help alleviate some of the pinch points in your business?
So a smart contract, is this on? Great. So a smart contract is actually not a contract, really. It's a piece of code that sits on top of the blockchain, and you give it instructions like you give any other computer code, and it executes them. So it's a very mechanical process, and it's a sort of fill in the blank, A follows B, or other from A to B to C. And it's interesting because there's this idea that you can make a sort of decode what is a legal problem into a mechanical problem. And I'm not sure that always works. But there are some instances where I think it can be very helpful. One place that we end up spending a lot of time, particularly in private transactions, is with the actual closing and how closings work, because you've got the money being held, and you've got the artwork waiting, being inspected, and you want to know that all of the pieces of that puzzle are going to work. And frequently, what that means for me is I'm sitting in a room with someone who's inspecting the painting, and I've got someone on the phone who's going to make sure that the money gets transferred. And we all, once the signal goes, we all wait and wait and wait till the Fed reference number comes through, and then, then the picture can go off and move on its merry way. And that's a very sort of mechanical process. It's, check each box and move on to the next one. And that's, I think, a place where that could be really useful.
Mm-hmm. So it would speed up the transaction.
Yeah.
Essentially. Okay. So Judith, I think you could also speak to the necessity of contracts from your side of the business on the insurance end. Can you say a little bit about how smart contracts might work for you?
Yeah. So I think that blockchain overall has a really cool opportunity. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take to realize some of these opportunities. I think in today's world that the blockchain has an opportunity for easy, one-time transactions that are mechanical, like Frank was talking about. But here's a couple of things that I thought about. So the first time I was asked to talk about blockchain, I was like, I don't even know about it. Explain this smart contract thing to me. And as they were talking, I'm like, oh. So here's an example way back when that I'm like, this could really be a cool opportunity. I don't know how many of you guys remember a title claim between Sears and Willis Tower. And here's the scenario. Sears had a Calder commissioned back in the 70s for a mobile in the lobby of Sears Tower. And they at some point, and in the contract, there was one paragraph that said, we have an option that we can buy back the Calder at some time in the future for a pre-designated price. They sold the Sears Tower. It got refinanced and refinanced and refinanced and refinanced. I think it was like 6 times before Willis actually bought the Sears Tower, at which point the Calders were increasing in price, and Sears raised their hand and said, we're going to call the option now, we want to buy it back. And Willis goes, what? So in this case, if in fact the first contract was put on the blockchain, and the second one and the third one was, I think it was like the fourth contract where the paragraph dropped out, the computer would have mechanically realized that there's a missing paragraph, and it could have been a risk management thing. And the litigation might have never happened because the paragraph wouldn't have come out. I also think that there's an opportunity, and I'll make it really quick because I know we get a lot of things. There's an opportunity to start it as artists, as objects leave the artist studio. And actually, I saw an announcement today for something called Bronze Chain, which is a partnership between Bronze Chain and Verisat, which is another one of these startups. And they may actually have a shot because the hallmark stamp that they're putting in goes into the wax before it ever gets cast. So I think there's a lot of really neat things starting to happen.
Yeah. For sure. Nicole, could I kick this over to you to talk a little bit about how an art logistics company like Crozier is approaching the subject? How might this be useful in your industry?
Right. So for Crozier, we're definitely taking a look at this from the supply chain perspective. Obviously, as an art logistics provider, who is both responsible within our own four walls and within our own network, caring for art, but also working with third-party providers in shipping artwork abroad. There's a lot of opportunities with a blockchain solution to be able to keep better track of the records of a transport as it goes through the supply chain. And you're actually seeing this out in the marketplace in non-art applications. It's being investigated by Maersk. There's a food safety initiative that they're looking at getting down to the piece of fruit or the box of fruit level to when there's a recall case. So you could also imagine from an art perspective being able to have a better insight into where your crate is right now, how long it's spent on the airline handling dock, which is pretty important, paired with IoT solution, and a lot of the supply chain stuff would depend on that. You could also write environmental data, which is really important to the care of the artwork. And so as a service provider, I mean, we see this as an opportunity where the market can hold our feet to the fire, and that's probably a good thing.
IoT, for anybody who's not familiar, is Internet of Things.
Right, so it would be potentially for a temperature sensor, a shock sensor, humidity sensor that would somehow be traveling with the artwork.
All of those smart objects that are now in your home,
Yeah.
listening to your conversations. All right. So another application sort of related to supply chains is this idea of title registries. And we talk a lot about the art market being completely unregulated or less regulated than other financial markets and asset classes. And the lack of a public repository for ownership is one example of that. And because price depends on provenance, a digital ledger that was publicly available would, its backers say, guard the ownership history and therefore the value of works of art. So this could be a potentially transformative development for title. I was wondering whether Frank wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of title.
Okay, well, title's important.
It's very important.
You want to make sure you have good title, and it is true that that's always an issue with artworks. A lot of people, when I talk to them, say, "Well, a transaction must be just like real estate," and the answer is no. And real estate doesn't move, and artworks do, and that makes things more complicated. And the notion of having a way to protect title through title insurance has been around for a while, and thanks to Judy. And it's something that people talk about a lot, but there hasn't been a centralized registry anyplace. That's in part, I think, because I'm not sure people want it. There's not a lot of transparency in the art market, and there are good reasons for that. Totally legitimate reasons like security. People don't necessarily want someone to know that they have an $80 million painting hanging in their living room. And if you sort of flip the problem on its head and look at the market, it was not quite 50 years ago, that the International Foundation for Art Research started working on a database for stolen artworks. So these are objects that are lost, that people want to get back, and there's a real incentive, you would think, to get that information out there. But in that half century, we haven't been able to even develop a centralized database for stolen works. They've got competing solutions, and it's just not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Judy, do you want to talk a little bit about title insurance from your perspective?
Not so much just the title insurance, but when I read what some of these new companies are trying to do, a couple of things I struggle with. Number one is, if you look at every single website, I think they're still confusing provenance with title. And those are two different things. So just because you have a good provenance doesn't mean that there isn't a problem with the trust, or there's family dynamics, or somebody's used the art as collateral for a loan, or we can kind of go on and on about the liens and encumbrances. That's number one. Number two is the registries are still voluntary. And until we have a scenario where they're compulsory, I don't know if they're ever really going to do anything. And the third part is they still talk about the opacity of the market, that you might not know, the owners might not want to put their names up there, and still that creates all sorts of challenges. So I worry that the technology people don't understand the art market well enough to solve the problems yet. So our job as a community is to help them do that.
Sorry, did you want to?
No, I agree.
And part of the disjunction there comes from the fact that this digital ledger would necessarily be separate from the physical object. So I know that Zach, in his role at Rhizome, has been doing a little thinking on how digital identifications and licensing might come to identify and disambiguate works in the future. Do you want to talk a little bit about Rhizome and what you
Sure.
do? Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah, sure. Just for those of you that don't know, I'm the director of Rhizome, which is the digital art affiliate of the New Museum. And for 22 years, we've championed kind of born digital practices. So we're coming to this conversation from a different point of view, a nonprofit point of view, an artist-centered point of view in a different way. And it's been interesting to see the field develop. Of course, we've been approached. Of course, digital things have a very nice affinity with a digital ledger and distribution system. So there's a reason why this field could have a better opportunity to take off in our niche than elsewhere. And yet, we've been brought a variety of projects that are really focused on the traditional art market use case, which our field isn't necessarily function at that level, for one. And number two, it's just, as you said, difficult to basically capture what makes an art object valuable and something as narrowly defined as a ledger with specific kind of metadata. That said, we've seen some of those companies pivot to, we're not talking about today, but like licensing of images, like where like a kind of
touch on that.
well, just like a blockchain solution might make a lot of sense with like distributing news photos with a simple fee structure attached to it, and we've seen that happen. But then on the opposite side, we've seen a lot of artists faced with these kind of new opportunities for distribution and provenance, kind of take ownership of it and like figure out interesting speculative ways to factor that into their practice, or at least to kind of create new spaces for them to explore. So one example of that is the Berlin-based Ascribe, which is really like a provenance and contract system. And we've seen artists specifically around that digital art community in Berlin really go to that and be interested in kind of making it their own. So yeah, I think it's like an interesting space to address for blockchain to thrive, because there's a natural affinity. And also like you might find the artists starting at the studio taking a real kind of interest in seeing what's actually possible in a much more organic way that can then find its way to a different market.
Yeah. Nicole, I know that you had some thoughts of two potential emerging ways forward for identification of art using blockchain. Do you want to talk about those?
They're not my ideas, but I have all the best ideas. So when it comes to, I think one of the things that we recognize for what we do would be incredibly important is being able to connect the physical with the digital, because we're the people who are responsible for the physical care of the art. And so when it comes to physical kind of identification, you've got sort of two branches of thinking out there. So the first is sort of a tagging methodology, and you could even think of, there's something probably very low-hanging right now today with RFID out there. But you run into, with a tagging piece, sort of this challenge of artist intent. And what are you doing by putting a piece of something foreign onto an object of art? So
that could be a chip. It could be a thread in a canvas.
it could be a piece of
digitized.
artificial DNA.
Yeah.
A whole bunch
There's a lot of
things.
different
Yep.
competing models out there right now.
Exactly. And honestly, from the perspective of like someone like Crozier, as we're thinking about doing this, we feel like we have to stay really agnostic to this particular piece of it, because artists are going to continue to innovate and throw curveballs at us and come up with new medium that none of the tagging technologies and none of the other technologies will be able to capture. So we have to really remain flexible, I think, as we think about how the kind of blockchain future looks if we're going down that path. And the other avenue, and so like the tagging approach, you could use it with older works. You can also think about integrating it into the piece itself, which is something that Zachary has probably seen a lot, obviously with the digital piece, but also embedded in the, the paper, for example. But then there's a kind of another approach, which is sort of from an analysis perspective. And so this is a solution that could really apply to old masterworks, to works that have been around too long that you don't want to attach something to. And so then we're talking about ultra high res imaging. We're talking about looking at like the fingerprint of the cracula. We're looking at paper patterns on a microscopic level, the fibers that the paper makes, brushstroke analysis. And there was actually, Frank and I were just talking before this panel, recently MIT did a very interesting project where they did an authentication project on drawings of Matisse, Picasso. They put some training data through the artificial intelligence algorithm and then tried to put some forgeries through and did a very good job of catching them. Obviously early days for something like that, but I think there's a lot of, this is a really interesting space. I think AI is gonna have a lot to do with it.
So how would having a digitized, a verified identification of a work be important for what you do, Frank?
Well, I would say that I'm the big skeptic here about, which you'll probably figure out anyway, about connecting the physical and the digital. I mean, I think that's the big stumbling block that nobody's found a good solution for yet, and I don't think one is imminent. But ideally, it could make a huge difference. I mean, I constantly work with clients and worry about, is the work authentic? Is this the same work that was in the photograph? Is this the actual owner of the piece? I mean, if you could track a work of art like that, it starts to make it almost more stable, like real estate. But again, I'm not sure the technology is there, and I'm not entirely sure the market wants it.
So our next stop on the potential applications is tokenization, or the creation of parallel digital assets that could be fractionalized and traded independently of the physical object. So this is yet another sort of leap, I think. And I think Zach has been doing some work with artists who are looking at tokenization. Can you tell us a little bit about the one project we...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a very recent project, and I'm sure that also a variety of artists have kind of experimented on a longer timeline. But very recently, the Dutch artist Jonas Lund, as alongside his gallery exhibition, I want to say a gallery exhibition in Barcelona, basically offered, I forget exactly what the number was, but a set number of tokens that would comprise his practice overall going ahead. So when I was saying that it's very interesting to see how artists who are more embracing the kind of ideas behind blockchain and integrating their practice, like Jonas is a good example, this is taking the conversation around blockchain and really inserting its ideas about distributed governance directly into an object, in this case, his practice overall, that can be measured and assessed and seen over time by the value of works that he produces, by the overall trajectory of his career. It's a really interesting example. The way he's approaching it is he's offered a number of tokens at a set price. He's also given away a number. So one of my colleagues at Rhizome was given 100 as kind of like a commitment to Rhizome's impact on this artist's development. And looking into the future at key moments as he assesses in his practice, he's going to open up the kind of decision process around works, around career decisions, to stakeholders on an ongoing basis. which should be a really interesting experiment to see on the long term.
And one of the stories that has attracted me the most recently is some research that's been done by Dr. Roman Krausel, who's a finance professor at the University of Luxembourg, and Amy Whitaker of NYU. They have done a very interesting study, as yet unpublished, looking at the resale values for admittedly two very high case or best case scenario artists, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. And this was sparked by an idea that they had that art, when it's made, is fairly low value, but then can gain value in the market over time. And there was a very famous episode where I believe it was Rauschenberg punched a collector at Christie's after a work that had initially sold for something like $8,000 was bought by said collector for about $85,000. So artists in the current art economy are often left out of some of the riches that accrue to the artwork later on. And this idea of fractionalization, wherein people could buy shares in an artwork, essentially, what Krausel and Whitaker are proposing is that artists and perhaps even their dealers could retain fractional ownership in the works at the time of their initial sale so that they could continue to share in the wealth that those works generate later on and potentially use those shares to access capital to finance new projects. And this is a really intriguing idea to me because I think it would really flip on its head the balance of power in the art world. So that's something that I'm very interested in tracking right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, just that really gets to like the governance opportunity in that, I've been to a number of panels that have been about artist resale rights and conversations like that would require a kind of governmental solution.
Right.
And this is of course like a market and technology-based solution where like the governance is way more exciting than many other kind of uses of blockchain technology overall.
Because resale rights would need to be administered, you'd have to do all kinds of follow-up and checking and making sure that those get paid, whereas in blockchain it would just be immediate transfer.
I'm dying to read that.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. Okay. So I think now is a good time at the midpoint to sort of turn to questions of whether or not this is truly viable. We've heard from a couple of people who are somewhat skeptical of the of the potential for blockchain to transform this world. And I would like to focus on the idea of transparency for a second, because this is the great holy grail of so many technology companies. Transparency puts the power in the hands of the people. And Frank, I think you briefly touched on it. I wanted to, do you think that the art world is ready for that kind of radical transparency?
I'm not sure that it is. I mean, I don't know if we have any collectors here. If we do, maybe you could raise your hand if you'd be happy to tell everyone in the world what's on your walls. Okay, somebody is.
We'll do questions at the end.
Yeah. Right. I think. Well, I think that's the question that I've been asking really is how you take this thing that exists not even just in the digital realm but dispersed in the digital realm on a distributed computing system, and try to find a way to make sure that the object that it describes is actually that object. And there are a lot of problems making that leap at the moment. Now, you talked about synthetic DNA, you talked about RFID. There are a lot of different kinds of solutions that people are using to try to find a fingerprint that would make this work. And I think eventually, there probably will be a good technology. I think it's probably a few years off. Don't trust that. I don't know anything about technology. That was a guess, but it does bring up this issue of transparency that Sarah raised, which the market to a certain extent really rejects transparency. I mean, part of part of what being an art dealer is knowing who the customers are and being able to connect. I mean, that's the way you make your profit, is knowing who is the person who is going to pay the most for this object. And if you control that information, then you control that profit.
It's the asymmetries that actually make the market function at a certain high level. Yeah. So, Nicole, you also raised the idea when we were emailing back and forth that it's very important who can write to the blockchain. And I think this is also touching on what your question, how that information gets recorded into the blockchain. And you proposed sort of a partnership or consortium of presumably vetted partners. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first of all, one of the pieces, of course, is just the immutability of the blockchain really requires that the data that goes in is good. Like even if everybody's well-meaning but just putting in bad data, that kind of dilutes the value of the blockchain. So of course, you just want to make sure that the value going in is well done, and that means that you want to make sure that people writing to that solution, or the machines writing to that solution, in the case where you have an IoT sensor, are not tamperable, are not acting in bad faith, and also just have good practices and good controls in place. Which is why I think in any blockchain solution, you're seeing a lot of people being very careful about who they include in their consortia. They want to make sure that. And anyone who writes to a art blockchain has validated information that they can stand behind, and I think that's the place where, in my opinion, like that's where the market needs to be the most kind of thoughtful, because yeah, absolutely, you could get yourself into trouble having the wrong person in there.
Yeah, you raised, Judy, earlier the idea that somebody might potentially offer for sale an artwork that they do not have correct title to. Are there bad actors out there who might try and influence this process? Is that what you're saying?
I've never heard of that ever. Actually, as I was preparing for that, I was wondering who might win between the Chicago Institute of Art and Trump over the Renoir. Remember that one? Who owns? I think when I really think about it is, I start with, how informed are the collectors really? So often we're on these panels and we talk about the intermediaries, and we talk about the museums, and we talk about the appraisers, and we talk about the logistics, but we really rarely are really talking about the collector themselves. And so I've always really questioned how informed the collectors are and how much they're willing to push some of this. I also think that until the economics dictate the efficiency, which we're getting there, because there's, the money's being taken out of this industry, that people aren't going to have to figure out how to do this in a more economical way until everybody's in that situation. So we're seeing the changes here. I really think also, unless the government is willing to dictate and regulates some kind of adoption, which I don't think anybody thinks the government really cares about the collectors. So I don't know if there's an incentive for the market to change their current behavior. But I also want to add something I wasn't thinking about until we were talking about this tokenization. I think it's also interesting that this tokenization might actually create more commoditization, which is going to really change what a collector is doing and what they want. So I just kind of even open up that to maybe changing behavior.
It's related to the idea of securitizing artworks and trading them like any other asset in a very fast, automatic, almost market. Again, sort of getting further away from the whole physical-digital divide. So I think what I'm hearing from almost all of you is that there needs to be some sort of mass buy-in for this to occur, and that it probably needs some kind of regulation imposed by the actors within it, ideally not by a government or other central figure, because that would defeat the purpose a little bit. So I'm just curious, where do you see this going in the future? How quickly are we going to get there? I think Nicole was perhaps on the more optimistic side for that.
I have to give you like a number of years.
We're gonna place some bets after
right.
this. So.
So I think you're gonna see, from the supply chain standpoint, it's already in the marketplace. So I mean, to a certain degree, again, not with fine art, but there are applications like we said before with food safety, with diamonds, a whole bunch of other applications already out there. So I think for the art market, you're probably going to see like micro kind of blockchain solutions in the near term. You're going to have a lot of also artists who are thinking about how they embed blockchain or use blockchain within their new art. And I think for the digital art world, it's a huge thing. But I think long term, it requires shift working with, for a supply chain solution, working with agencies and working with massive international shipping networks potentially. That's going to take a long time. And there's like EDI is a great example, which is the electronic data interchange, I think. I mean, that has it's like 3 or 4 decades in, and it's still a tough thing. So, sorry, probably getting a little logistics heavy there, but point being, it's a big question, and you need a lot of people at the table to come to consensus. So that's going to be challenging.
Do you see any demand from your clients, Frank, for buy-in to that kind of a system?
Well, I think that on the logistics end, I think it's really exciting. I was making a joke with Nicole earlier about my favorite exclusion in their insurance policy, which is mysterious disappearance. And the notion that you can track an object for a collector while it's in storage, while it's being shipped, if you could track the climate control, all of that I think is really nice, and I think that would really enhance the experience of owning art and make a lot of things easier and safer. I think the bigger shift towards a title registry or towards really being able to use this for provenance or authenticity purposes, I think that's a much longer term thing, not just in terms of technology, but I think it would require a real shift in the view of the market.
Because it could potentially cut out several of the middle people who are involved in such transactions, yes?
And also a little bit of the mystique of collecting. I mean, part of that is like, you got to be the person who gets to the object and gets it. So,
What about the intangibles? Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Do you have thoughts on how quickly we might be getting there?
Probably not much new, because I do think that there's some really opportunistic ways to use it. And I actually hope the art market really takes on it. And like what you're saying with the artists, I think some of the artists are going to drive some really interesting things in the marketplace in the next year or two. I think over time that the blockchain is just going to be part of our life, and we're going to figure out and we're going to adapt and we're going to get there. But I think it's going to be a long time before it solves the issues that we're talking about.
Okay, so I think now is a great time to open it up to...
Actually, I have
sorry,
sorry,
go, yeah,
I'll take
please
a
go
more
ahead. Sorry.
cosmic view on it because, again, I don't speak from the art market point of view per se. It's the kind of, I think right now for most people outside of this room, and even some people inside of this room, like the idea of blockchain is entirely connected to what they've heard in the news of like a boom and bust, Bitcoin, financial speculation kind of conversation. And that happens, and that will probably be the case until there is some killer application that makes it transparent. One of the examples which I think I used in the email to you when we were talking is that like right now everyone's like, okay, we're on the precipice of this augmented reality movement as like a society. And yet like anyone who uses Instagram stories has likely used an augmented reality app by like messing with their face in the app. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that like it could just happen all at once. And I don't think that the art market will lead, but I think that when the solutions are made transparent, made accessible, they'll be applied. And maybe just one other data point, which I found is really interesting, is each year we do a program, it's Rhizome's big program, which brings together artists and technologists, and we at a very high level. And the idea is that we kind of go to an artist and ask them what they're interested in and try and pair them with someone from the technology field that makes a lot of sense. And this was the first year that 3 artists Avery Singer, Sean Raspid, and Dina Yago all asked to work with folks from the blockchain field. And none of them came to us through the prism of, the financial market. They all came through these kind of governance promises and possibilities. And that makes me think that oh yeah, it could just happen. The light will be turned on and this will be part of our vocabulary, maybe not even as blockchain, but with its values and with the technology intact.
It's interesting. I like the idea that artists could be the leaders here. And I think that is a good place to leave it. Feel free to come up and ask any of us. Is it okay if I volunteer everybody for that afterwards? And thank you all so much for your patience and your great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.